Thanks for tuning in to Better FAQ. We want to tell you today about the different types of ways to offer ownership in your company. Now, the traditional way to offer ownership is for someone to pay money for that ownership and they receive that ownership in return. They get it all right then, outright. A bunch of paperwork has to happen, and it's important to note that for everything that I'm going to discuss in this video, there's lots of compliance and lots of paperwork that goes into these different types of instruments, types of paperwork, so to speak. I'm going to use that interchangeably, paperwork, instruments, to give people ownership. There is always a lot of compliance underlying any type of ownership grant to an individual or a company. So keep that in mind with all of this. I'm going to be oversimplifying these instruments and just really giving you the idea behind what they are and how they work. The paperwork is something that we would discuss more in length when we were going to draft these things up for you and for your investors or your employees or whoever is receiving ownership. So, traditional way, I kind of call it straight equity, where someone pays money or they provide services and they receive their equity in return. They get all of it outright, all at once. Sometimes you can do something called a vesting schedule. A vesting schedule is where someone would receive their ownership over time. Typically, it's going to include something called a cliff. A cliff is going to be 6 months, a year, it can be any period of time. And that cliff period is going to be where they typically provide services. And during that period of time, let's say a year in this example, if they leave the company or they're fired or for whatever reason, the idea to give them ownership is going to be terminated within that first year. That can happen. They don't receive any ownership, and they actually only start receiving ownership after the cliff. So after the first year in this example, meaning that let's say you put someone on a 5-year vesting schedule with a 1-year cliff. So if it started right now, it'd be 1 year till they receive any ownership at all. Then at that 1-year mark, they would start to receive their ownership on whatever interval you set out in the paperwork. Let's say it's every 6 months. So 1 year, no ownership. If they make it past the 1 year, then at that point in time, they'll receive 10 shares per every 6 months until they reach the total of number of shares that they have been offered. That would be a vesting schedule, 5 years with a 1-year cliff. That's straight equity where someone just receives the equity. Now, there are other instruments and ways to give equity that are a little bit less straightforward. That's why that one's straight equity, these ones are not. These ones are typically going to be types of instruments where someone is promised ownership, but then a certain number of things have to happen in a certain time period for them to actually receive that ownership, which they would actually receive later. And the benefit of these types of plans, the main one that we work with is something called restricted stock units. And that essentially is going to be a plan where, let's say you're going to offer someone ownership, but in order for them to receive that ownership, they need to stick around and provide services or consulting for 5 years. Again, we'll use 5 years. And within that 5 years, the company has to get acquired, or it has to go public, or it has to do a round of fundraising with outside investors. And if both of those things happen, they stick around for the 5 years and they're providing the services they are expected to provide, and that other thing happens, acquisition, round of fundraising, whatever it may be, then at that point in time, when that event happens, let's say an acquisition, their ownership is triggered throughout the process of that acquisition and they receive it then. That's sort of like a promise for future equity. And one of the benefits of that is that they don't actually have equity then in that interim period of time during that 5-year period until the thing happens, which means you have less shareholders or owners. And that means that they don't get a vote, they don't have control over the company. And so that can be really beneficial because it incentivizes them to do what they're expected to do for that period of time on the promise that they will receive ownership later, but the company doesn't have more cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, with more owners. That's restricted stock unit plans. Now, convertible instruments are another great instrument or paperwork to use for ownership. These typically, so restricted stock unit plans are typically for people providing services, whereas convertible instruments are typically going to be where people pay money and then they receive equity in the future. And how that works here is they pay the money in, they get that convertible note back, almost like a loan note, like a promissory note. And these are pretty similar. They're like a hybrid between a loan and equity. And so for a convertible note, they pay the money in, and then in that document, that instrument, the convertible note's one kind, a safe is the other kind. It's simple agreement for future equity, safe. And with these instruments, they pay the money, and then at some future date, almost like a loan, there's a maturity date. And at that point in time, they are going to receive equity. Now, convertible notes, it's straightforward. At that maturity date, they either receive equity or it converts into a loan and has to be paid back. That's the terms. That's how it works. They get equity or they get paid back. It's pretty beneficial for that investor with a convertible note. With a safe, on the other hand, a safe is more beneficial to the company that's giving the ownership. And the reason for that is that under a safe, they pay money, they get a document that says they get equity in the future if something happens. But if that thing doesn't happen, acquisition, round of fundraising, whatever it is, if that thing doesn't happen, they don't get anything. It doesn't convert into a loan that they're paid back on. They get nothing. Them's the breaks. And that's an instrument that is super beneficial, like I said, to the company, but it's only something that investors that are seasoned and understand that sometimes they're going to take a loss on an investment are probably willing to accept. And so, very different, these different types of ways to give equity. Straight equity, where you just give it out, maybe on a vesting schedule with a cliff. Then you have restricted stock unit plans, usually to incentivize performance for your staff or consultants or advisors. And then you have convertible instruments like a convertible note and a safe, typically more applicable for investors. Sometimes accelerators will use these for startups. And those all are going to be ways to give people ownership in your company, some right up front, some in the future, some in the future. They all have different sort of inner workings and benefits, and different people are going to have different preferences as to which one they would like to accept. So these are the general options that we lay out for clients on how to give out ownership to people. There are other things like employee stock option plans and stock options and stock warrants. We don't deal a lot with those because they have a lot more difficult compliance that are typically a little bit too expensive for smaller or medium-sized businesses. So the ones that I have laid out are typically going to be the ones that are the most affordable to implement and are the most flexible for who's giving out that ownership. So, as always, I hope this was helpful. Hope you liked the thumbs up I'm giving, I guess, and hope you tune in and you're not scared off by whatever that is that I just did. Thank you.